Our gospel lesson tonight comes from 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 31 through 37. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant was struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Everyone knows the story of David and Goliath and how David beats Goliath with only a sling and a stone. However, let's take a closer look at the main people in this story. First, we have Goliath of Gath, the Philistine champion. Now imagine with me for a minute just what Goliath looked like. Earlier in chapter 17, he is described as being 6 cubits and a span tall, which equates to about 9 feet 9 inches. He is armed with the best armor that the skilled Philistines could either make or acquire. This includes a large standing shield, held by his shield bearer, of course, a large bronze sword, a long sturdy spear, likely with an iron tip, a bronze helmet, and a complete coat of armor. Altogether, his armor weighed around 126 pounds, indicating that Goliath was also very strong. Could you imagine a man of this size and stature and strength standing in front of you? He not only is a very large, strong man, but he also has the arrogance to go with it. He continually steps out into the open valley, stating that he can defeat any champion Israel can put forward. Then, to really hit home the intimidation factor, Goliath taunts the Israelite army by saying, "If you are so committed to your king, then put your best fighter against me. If your champion kills me, the Philistines will become your slaves." If you think about it, it would be hard not to be afraid in that very intimidating situation. And all of the Israel army, including Saul, their king, were afraid because they felt they had no champion that could stand up against Goliath. Goliath's size, strength, and arrogance made them forget about their one true champion, the Lord their God. Now this brings us around to Saul. Saul was God's chosen leader and the king at the time. However, Saul was continually falling in and out of favor with God. Saul chose to depend on God. He had some great successes in his reign when he did so. However, when he tried to be independent and do things on his own, he also had some great failures. Saul failed to recognize over his life that even his weaknesses could be used to fight by God if he had only continued to be dependent upon him. It just so happens that at this point, when Goliath was continually making his challenge day after day, Saul was not depending on God. As king and a skilled warrior, Saul should have been the one to accept the challenge of Goliath. However, Saul was looking at this challenge from a very independent point of view and thinking, "I can't do this." As a result of Saul's independence, he feared Goliath instead of depending upon God to help him overcome his weakness. Finally, we come to David, who would eventually become the greatest king of Israel. David had an unchangeable faith in God. He depended on him in everything he did. David was by far not perfect. Alongside the things he is most known for being, a shepherd, a poet, a king, and a giant killer, there is also another list: betrayer, liar, adulterer. However, it is important for us to know that while David was not perfect, he was quick to confess his sins and ask for forgiveness. He never let go of his dependence on God. At this particular point in David's life, he was somewhere around age 14, a child by most standards. Yet even in his young age, he displayed a dependence on God that the Israelite army and the king just couldn't understand at the time. When we first see David in this chapter, he has been sent to take food and rations to his 3 oldest brothers who are serving in the Israelite army. He does not find his brothers right away. Instead, he hears Goliath step out and give his challenge. And then he sees what's going on around him and hears the scared reaction from the army. We first see David's unwavering dependence upon God when he responds to the scared army, he himself showing no fear. In verse 26, he says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" David is eventually summoned to speak with Saul, and we see 2 additional times where David displays his dependence upon God during this interaction. In the gospel passage for today, David tells Saul, "I will go and fight this battle with the Philistine for you." However, Saul is almost mocking David when he says, "But you are just a boy and have no fighting experience to be able to go up against such a seasoned warrior?" David confidently replies, "I have no problems taking delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." So even though Saul does not appear to be as confident as David, that David can kill Goliath even with God's help, Saul tells David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." The second time we see David's dependence upon God during this interaction with Saul is during his armor fitting. Saul begins fitting David with armor, a shield, and weapons, similar to what Goliath had. Because Saul is still seeing a young teenage boy with no fighting experience. He still is not really grasping that David's dependence upon the Lord will keep him safe. Can you picture it? A small 14-year-old boy wearing 126 pounds of armor and weapons? How could a small teenage boy move, let alone wear that much armor? So David tells Saul in verse 39, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." To David, this is a spiritual battle to which he does not need armor that he has never used and likely couldn't use properly. He needs God's help, which he has depended on in the past and has tested, tried, and true. So David removed all the armor that Saul had outfitted him with and took only 5 small stones, his sling, which he happens to be very skilled with, killing lions and bears, and his staff. Finally, we see David's dependence upon the Lord during the battle with Goliath. Goliath, of course, is still trying to intimidate David through mockery, because all Goliath sees in front of him is a young, weak boy carrying a staff and a bag. Goliath was blinded by his worldly view and did not see David's greatest weapon, God's spiritual armor surrounding David. And of course, the sling in his bag. David, with all his faithfulness and dependence on God, says to Goliath in verse 45, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." We all know how the story ends. David slings the stone, hits Goliath in the head, and kills him, bringing victory for the Israelites. It was David's faith and his dependence on God that kept him from being harmed that day. God granted him victory, just as David had declared. We live in a world today where we are taught throughout our lives the need for being independent, to grow up properly and become responsible, independent adults. When we are babies, we are taught to get around on our own by crawling and walking, then to eat on our own, and of course to talk on our own. Around about the teenage years, though, some of us probably wish they hadn't learned to talk. And then there's the ever infamous potty training. As we get older, we are taught to keep our rooms clean, which for most kids rarely happens. We start to learn to study independently, manage our time, get good grades, maybe stay overnight with a friend, or being allowed to go on our own. Eventually, we'll learn to drive, giving us even more independence and our parents more worry. We are then able to go to work, school, or to a friend's house on our own. Next, of course, comes college, our first job, and even our first apartment or house. We are trained over and over again throughout our worldly life to be self-sufficient and independent. It is almost ingrained in us. However, while we strive for our worldly independence, we should never shed our spiritual independence. The best way for me to illustrate this is most of you are probably aware with the game of Jenga. For those of you that may not be, it's a tower of blocks. You strategically set them up, or uniformly set them up, I guess. The upper blocks depending on the lower blocks for the tower to remain standing. The goal of the game is taking turns to remove a block from the tower without the tower collapsing. I want you to picture that tower of Jenga blocks standing up, and each piece represents one of those moments in life where we become more independent. So think of it as removing a worldly dependency. Eating block, gone. Walking and talking blocks, removed. Learning to drive, a first apartment, a first job, you're out of there. You can safely remove all of those worldly dependencies without the Jenga tower falling. However, if we try to remove that one last piece, our spiritual dependence on God, what happens? The Jenga tower falls. You see, God is always there, both in the good times and the bad times, trying to help hold us up. It is whether we choose to lean into and depend on Him, which allows Him to continue to be there for us, supporting us, comforting us, strengthening us, or fighting for us in whatever life throws our way. Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. So, just like David trusted in and was dependent upon God in defeating Goliath with nothing more than a mere sling, we too should always lean into our faith and be dependent upon God in the good times and the bad times, never removing that one final block that makes the tower come crashing down. Amen.